Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. In this video, I will tell you about fantasy story. Do you know what a fantasy story? Ever read it? Okay. In this explanation, we will discuss interesting things about fantasy story that you need to understand. Do you remember when you were in elementary school or maybe before entering school? Did you ever read books that contain fantasy or unreal story? For example, the story of the mermaid, the mouse deer, Roro Jonggrang, or the famous Bandung Bondowoso. All the titles of the stories, including the text of fantasy story in the form of fantasy from the author. You know? Then what is the meaning of fantasy story? Let's identify the meaning, element, structure, and the types of fantasy story text. The first is definition of fantasy story text. Fantasy story text is written material in the form of an essay or writing to tell, describe, or imagine various action, experience, and even in the form of wishful thinking, fantasy, imagination, or more fiction. In other words, the things described in the fantasy text are things that are not real or fictional fantasy story. The elements, well, here are the elements of fantasy story text that you can pay attention to. These elements are the difference between fantasy story text and other types of text. You know, the first, there is a magic, strangeness, and mystery. Fantasy story text is a fantasy type fiction story, an imaginative world created by the author. In fantasy story text, supernatural, mysterious, and occult things are revealed that are not found in the real world. So, in fantasy story text, the impossible seems to be commonplace. The character and setting created by the author do not exist in the real world or real world modification. Story idea. The idea of a fantasy story text is open to author imagination. That is not limited by reality or real life. The idea of this story can also be a slice of the real world and imaginary world created by the author. The story idea in this text is sometimes simple, but it is able to leave an interesting message. Fantasy story themes are supernatural or futuristic. The third, using various settings across space and time. The event experienced by the characters occur in two settings, namely those that still exist in everyday life and those that do not exist in everyday life. The plot and setting of the fantasy story has its own characteristic. A series of fantasy story even using various settings that break through the dimension of space and time. The chain of events in fantasy story move from various settings across time and space. The fourth is unique character, because they are having supernatural powers. Character in fantasy story can be given unique character and characteristic which do not exist in everyday life. Character have certain supernatural powers. Character experience mysterious events that do not occur in everyday life. Character experience even in various time settings. Character also exists in different times and place. Sometimes can be past or future or futuristic. And the fifth is fictional fantasy story are fictional, not real even. Fantasy story can be inspired by a real setting or real objects in life, but are given fantasy. And the next, a language that use of synonym is conveyed with strong emotion and quiet prominent word variation. The language used is varied expressive and use a variety of conversation, not formal language. Fantasy story text example so that you can better understand the fantasy story text. I will tell it for you. The is golden cucumber. Once upon a time, there was a widow who had no children named Bo Srini. While going to the forest, she was visited by a giant who gave him cucumber seeds. The giant said that he would have children through the cucumber seeds. Bo Srini went home and planted the cucumber seeds. After some time, the cucumber plant only bears one fruit. The color is golden. She split the fruit and was surprised because it contained a baby girl. The child was named Timun Mas. Long story short, Timun Mas is an adult. One night, Bo Srini dreamed of being visited by giant. The giant will pick up Timun Mas in a week. Bo Srini was afraid. Then she met a magic hermit. The hermit gave 4 small packets containing cucumber seeds, needles, salt, and shrimp paste. Of the appointed day, Bo Srini asked Timun Mas to leave. The giant gazed after him. Timun Mas opened the first cake. Immediately, the surrounding became cucumber fields and hindered the giant. As soon as he was about to be chowed again, Timun Mas opened the second package. In an instant, the surrounding became a grove of spiky bamboo tree. The giant continued to cast even though it was injured. Timun Mas opened the third package. The surrounding area became a vast ocean. However, the giant was able to get through it terrified. Timun Mas threw the last package. The surrounding turned into a sea of boiling mud. The giant fell and died. Congratulations, Timun Mas. She met his mother and they lived happily. Okay, thank you for your attention. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.